Hi, it's Whitney again, and we're here today to talk about semicolons, the dreaded semicolon. One of the most common questions I get is, how do I use these things? So today we're going to tackle it. I like to say that semicolons are a bit like pink plastic flamingos because most of us don't really know what they're for and we tend to overuse them. But fortunately, semicolons can be useful as long as we remember a few rules for how to use them. I don't know if we can say the same for pink plastic flamingos. Semicolons can be used to join independent clauses. What's an independent clause? Well, it's a complete sentence, essentially. It's a complete thought. It has a subject and a verb, and it can stand alone by itself as a complete sentence. So semicolons in that way are interchangeable with periods. If you could use a period there, you can use a semicolon there, except obviously at the end of a sentence. We would not want to end a sentence with a semicolon. So if that's the case, if semicolons and periods are essentially the same functionally, then how do I decide when to use a semicolon versus when to use a period? Well, basically it's a style choice most of the time, but that said, there are some guidelines to help you to make that decision. So style-wise, it's most appropriate to use a semicolon when you are connecting related ideas. Okay, so an example of that might be this sentence. Sarah liked caring for Mr. Barnes. He was polite, interesting to talk to, and appreciative. Sounds like a nice patient, right? So in this sentence, the second clause expands on the first and gives us more detail about it. Sarah liked caring for Mr. Barnes. Obviously, that is an independent clause because that could stand alone as a complete sentence. And so could the second half. He was polite, interesting to talk to, and appreciative. Both independent clauses in which the second one gives us more detail about the first to help us understand it better. So good example of when we might use a semicolon. Now I want to make it clear, it would not be incorrect to use a period there. You could use a period there. But a period is very firm, definite punctuation. It is a definite, hard stop. A semicolon is also a fairly hard stop, but it's not as definite and hard as a period. So it's a pause, and it gives us more of a pause than a comma, but less of a pause than a period. So when you kind of want to say, well, I don't want to completely build a wall here and then move on to something completely different. I want to flow from, a little more gently from the first part of my sentence to the second and expand upon what I'm saying. In that case, a semicolon might be better than a period. The clause that follows a semicolon can also restate or present a contrast to the idea that you expressed in the first part. So let's give an example of each of those. So let's give an example of restating. It's crucial for doctoral students to hone their writing skills early. It's important to acquire good communication skills as soon as possible. So in this case, we have the first clause saying it's crucial for doctoral students to hone their writing skills early, and then the second part basically just restates the first with maybe a little bit more detail. It's important to acquire good communication skills as soon as possible. So very much related, those two clauses. Again, it would be okay to use a period there too, but this author wanted a briefer pause, wanted that to flow a little bit more smoothly, so a semicolon is a good style choice there. An example of a second clause that presents a contrast to the first, and remember, contrast is still related. So it's still a related idea, even if it's presenting the opposing view. Some writing teachers still stand by the traditional 5-paragraph essay model. Some have abandoned it as too simplistic. I'm one of those that thinks it's too simplistic, by the way, in case you were wondering where I stand on that. I don't like the 5-paragraph essay. But in this case, we have a clause, telling us basically both sides of a debate. So we have an idea expressed, and then we have the opposite idea expressed. Again, a period would also be okay here, but if you want your idea one to flow into the next quite smoothly with less of a pause, a semicolon is a good choice. Okay, more details. A semicolon should link independent clauses joined by conjunctive adverbs or transitional expressions. Now, a conjunctive adverb is a word like however, therefore, indeed, moreover, some of those little transition words that we often use, those are called conjunctive adverbs. Transitional expressions are phrases like in fact, in addition, for example, for instance. So phrases like that are transitional expressions. And a semicolon should link independent clauses that are joined by these. So let's give an example. We love the color scheme the designer chose for the living room. However, that pea green wallpaper in the bedroom is awful. So when you have a conjunctive adverb like however or therefore in the middle of a sentence, and when that conjunctive adverb starts an independent clause, as in this case, then you're going to want to separate that from the previous part of the sentence with a semicolon. And by the way, you're also going to want to follow that word with a comma. So first we have a semicolon, then we have our conjunctive adverb, however, and then we have a comma. So an example of a transitional expression, the festival will be the cultural highlight of the season. In fact, we're expecting the largest crowd ever this year. So again, we've got our transitional expression, in fact. We're going to precede it with a semicolon and follow it with a comma. And again, you could use a period instead of the semicolon, but style-wise, it's often better to use a semicolon. Okay, moving on. If two independent clauses are joined by a conjunction, so a conjunction, if you remember from Schoolhouse Rock, conjunction, junction, conjunctions are and, but, and or. So if you have two independent clauses that are joined by and, but, or, and they contain commas, sometimes it's good to use a semicolon instead of a comma to make that sentence easier to read. And I'm going to give you an example. Every month, no matter how firmly he resolves to stick to a budget, he ends up running low on funds within a few weeks. And he has to eat ramen noodles, tuna, and cup of soup until his next payday. So it wouldn't be wrong to use a comma where I have a semicolon there. It's not wrong. It just might be more readable if we use a semicolon, because otherwise we've kind of got comma-palooza going on in there. So it's up to you in that instance. Normally, you are going to use commas to separate items in a series. If you have a list of things, like I went to the movies and I got popcorn, soda, and candy, right? In that case, you're going to separate those list items with a comma, and that is going to be true most of the time. Like in this example, the patient screamed at the triage nurse, refused to put on a gown, and threw up all over the resident who examined him. Yikes, that's a fun Friday, right? In this case, commas are totally fine. But there are instances when you have a list or a series and one or more of those items in the series has its own comma or other punctuation. In that case, again, to avoid comma-palooza and possible confusion, using semicolons makes the sentence easier to read. So let's look at an example. The patient screamed at the triage nurse, comma, who cried and left the room, bless her heart, refused to put on a gown, comma, even though his clothes were filthy, and threw up all over the resident who examined him. Yikes. So in this case, we have a slightly more detailed list, where we have list items that have their own internal punctuation. We've got screamed at the triage nurse, comma, who cried and left the room. We've got refused to put on a gown, comma, even though his clothes were filthy. So if you were to imagine this sentence without those semicolons and with just commas instead, I think you will agree that there'd be a lot of comma action in there. And the semicolons make it a little bit easier to tell which are the list items. So to delineate between the list items. It's not necessarily wrong exactly to use commas there, although if I were, grading the paper, I would probably say you should use semicolons here instead. Because I don't know if it's the case in this example, but there are sentences, plenty of examples of those where if you were to use commas instead of semicolons, you might actually muddy the meaning and make it hard to tell what the list items are. So moving on. So let's review. When do we use semicolons? Number one, we use semicolons interchangeably with periods to separate independent clauses, aka complete sentences, which express related ideas. Number two, we use semicolons to connect independent clauses joined by a conjunctive adverb, such as however, therefore, indeed, etc., or transitional expression, such as for example, in addition, in fact, etc. 3. We use semicolons to separate items in a list in which one or more of the items in the list has its own internal punctuation. And lastly, we use semicolons to separate independent clauses joined by a conjunction, such as and, but, and or, if it would make the sentence more readable. And the rule of thumb in writing should always be clarity, readability. Those are the most important things, so that your reader is picking up what you're putting down. And that's it. Those are the rules for semicolons. Really, fairly small number of rules as opposed to the rules that govern commas, which, there are a lot more of those. So I hope that this has been helpful. I hope you can bookmark this video and come back to it if you have questions later. And I hope you guys have a great day. Go out and use those semicolons and maybe take down those pink plastic flamingos, right? Okay. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.